The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, cultural commentators have noted a profound distrust in many long-standing institutions these days. Particularly younger generations are losing trust and therefore turning away from institutions that had previously defined Western civilization. Social institutions like marriage, educational institutions like college, and especially religious institutions like the church. And sometimes that distrust of institutions is for very understandable reasons. When children watch their parents get divorced, they're going to be gun-shy about getting married themselves one day. When young people see university education turning into an expensive form of indoctrination, they would rather just go straight into the workforce and start earning money. And when younger generations see corruption or hypocrisy or arrogance in the church, they would sometimes rather get their spiritual guidance from YouTube or TikTok than having to go to church every Sunday. Now, the point of naming all of that is not to excuse people who want to opt out of participating in important institutions, but rather to highlight a problem that our society has been experiencing for decades now. Human institutions are often messy and contradictory and difficult to navigate. Therefore, many people would rather just go it alone. And while I'm not convinced that that's the primary reason why many young people aren't going to churches today, it is at least a reason. Well, this is relevant because what we see in our text today is Jesus openly challenging one of the greatest institutions of the ancient world, the Jewish temple. But what we'll see is not that Jesus is anti-institution, but that he wants to send the message that only he can provide what even something as great as the Jewish temple cannot provide. What this episode of the cleansing of the temple displays about Jesus is two main things, which will be the 2 points of our outline today, and that's in your bulletin. Number one, Jesus is the highest authority. And number two, Jesus is the focal point of our trust and devotion. So last time we saw that Jesus had begun his public ministry by handpicking a few of his first disciples there in chapter 1. And then we have Jesus' first public miracle at the wedding of Cana there at the beginning of chapter 2. And those are two things that we might expect the Messiah sent from God to do. But when we get to this latter half of chapter 2, we might wonder why John, the gospel writer, includes this episode of Jesus cleansing the temple in Jerusalem. Well, the quick answer is that the cleansing of the temple, while not a grand miracle, is a sign of who Jesus is. But a possible misunderstanding needs to be cleared up before we get too deep into the narrative. Bible readers might get the false impression that the entirety of Jesus' ministry was all about breaking from the old ways, essentially dismantling the law of Moses and forsaking all Jewish customs and institutions, including the temple. But we need to remember that the temple was God's idea. God had Moses construct the precursor to the temple, the tabernacle, after receiving the law at Mount Sinai. The tabernacle and later the temple was to be a holy place in which God would manifest his presence in a special way. It was the place where Moses and the high priest came to meet with God. And it was the place where sacrifices were offered for the sins of the Israelites. And while the Israelites always understood that God could not be contained by a building, the tabernacle and temple were thought of as the earthly dwelling place of God, the place where heaven met earth. The tabernacle was a portable dwelling place, basically a tent that the Israelites could pack up and move as they journeyed through the wilderness, and even in the early years of their time in the Promised Land. But once the monarchy was established, God told King David that David's son would be the one to build God a permanent house, a temple that would be anchored in one spot, Jerusalem. And so Solomon would build a grand temple, which would stand for many years. It would be the very center of Israel's society and religion until it eventually was destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. The Israelites then went more than 70 years without a temple during their time of exile. But God would have it that they would return to the land and rebuild their temple. He caused a pagan king named Cyrus to issue a decree that allowed a remnant of the Israelites to go back and rebuild. And so by the time we get to the 1st century AD, what we have is the second temple. And while it wasn't as grand and glorious as the first temple, it was still God's temple and therefore worthy of honor. So the reason for Jesus getting angry and cleansing the temple was not that he was against the institution of the temple as such, but because of how corrupt it had become due to the negligence and the greed of its leaders. The vendors and money changers had set up shop right in the middle of the temple court, which surrounds the temple building itself, and were disrupting the worship and prayer of those who were there to observe Passover. So Jesus was rightfully angry that they had turned his Father's house into a house of wheeling and dealing, rather than a house of prayer and devotion. But we also shouldn't look at this as an instance of Jesus losing his cool and just flying off the handle. He was certainly upset, but what he did was not just a spur-of-the-moment emotional outburst. Instead, he was sending a message to the temple authorities. And we see the response to what Jesus does there in verse 18. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" The Jewish authorities seem to pick up on the fact that Jesus is more than just some crazy person who wandered into the temple and decided to cause a scene. So instead of escorting him out or immediately arresting him, they ask him a question about where he thinks he gets his authority to do this. And we can see that that's actually the right kind of question for them to ask, because Jesus doesn't dismiss it. They expect him to claim some kind of divine authority, since he's presuming to act on behalf of God. And they follow up their question with a request to see some kind of sign that would authenticate Jesus' authority. Now, of course, we all know that Jesus did have divine authority for doing what he did because he is the Son of God himself. But the temple authorities understandably wanted some kind of confirmation of his presumed authority. Yet Jesus doesn't immediately respond with a sign. Instead, he responds with the promise of a sign. In verses 19 through 21, we read again, Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and when you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When Jesus was saying, what Jesus was saying probably sounded both blasphemous and impossible to the authorities. Blasphemous because here was some no-name guy apparently encouraging the destruction of the most sacred place in the world according to the Jews. And impossible because the temple was a massive edifice that couldn't be rebuilt in just a few days. The authorities say that it took 46 years to build it. But actually, the temple was still under construction at that point in history and wouldn't be completed until 63 AD. So they were right to think it impossible for a single human being to rebuild the temple in just a few days. But as the author of this gospel tells us right away, Jesus wasn't talking about the man-made temple that they were standing in, but rather his own body. Jesus was talking about his death and resurrection. But of course, they didn't grasp that, and neither did his disciples until after he had been raised from the dead. Nonetheless, Jesus was telling them how it was that he had authority to cleanse the temple, because he was the one who had authority not only over the temple, but over life itself. Jesus had more authority than they could ever have imagined. So, as Thomas Aquinas once wrote, Jesus gave them a sign clothed in a symbol. He didn't give them the kind of immediate and miraculous sign that they were wanting, but if they had the spiritual eyes to see and the spiritual ears to hear, then they would have realized the claim that he was making for himself. He had the right to cleanse and even condemn the temple because it was his temple. Well, as we move on to point number 2, it's important to realize that the corruption and negligence Jesus witnessed in the temple at that time was not something that was isolated. It wasn't as if he just happened upon them on a bad day. No, the institution of the temple and everything related to that institution, including the priests, had largely become corrupt. John's gospel doesn't really touch upon it at this point, but if you want to read a scathing critique of the priests and the temple authorities, then read the 23rd chapter of Matthew's gospel. To quote just a few lines from Jesus' diatribe against the Jewish leaders there in Matthew 23, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Now, that was a big part of the reason that Jesus was critical of the temple and everything associated with it. Its personnel had become a bunch of whitewashed tombs. Men who acted holy and put on a good show, but who were inwardly corrupt. When Jesus threw over the tables and drove out the livestock, the authorities probably thought that he was defiling the temple. But the reality was that they had been defiling the temple for years with their hypocrisy, with their inward pride, with their lack of care for the downtrodden, with their lawlessness. Therefore, what had once been a God-given holy institution had now become a corrupt institution to the extent that it became an excessively human institution, serving the needs of the religious leaders rather than providing for the worship of God. To connect this to our current times, this is what we see happening in all kinds of institutions today. No matter how good and helpful they start out being, it only takes a few bad apples to corrupt the whole system. The Christian church in particular has been rocked by scandal after scandal throughout history. And with the advent of social media, people can hear about the plethora of various scandals almost instantaneously. Therefore, one of the reasons that young people tend to cite when they're given surveys about why they don't attend church is that the institution of the church itself has become hypocritical and untrustworthy in their eyes. And once again, I'm not convinced that that's the main reason why many young people aren't coming to church, but it is a reason. But the truth is, every institution that is run by human beings is liable to become corrupt. And we can see that within various businesses, with media outlets, with universities, and most tragically with individual churches. Now, I don't think that the solution is just to give up every human institution and retreat from society. And Jesus calls to be in the world even as we're not of the world. And Christians should continue to participate in human institutions as long as there's still something worthwhile about them. And obviously, as a pastor, I don't think that people should stop going to church altogether, just because there are certain churches and church leaders that are definitely corrupt. Instead, what's needed is for all believers to have a realistic view of the institutions of this world. Human institutions aren't going to be perfect because human beings, even Christian human beings, aren't perfect. Well, if we have a realistic understanding of the deep sinfulness of human beings, then we're not going to be shocked when we see human beings and human institutions behaving badly. We should certainly condemn that behavior when it happens, but that doesn't mean that we should retreat or just not participate in anything. Instead, we should faithfully engage in those institutions, especially in the church, and seek to make them better, not by leaning on our own understanding, but by leaning on God. But devotion to God seems to have been lacking in the temple authorities of Jesus' time. Therefore, he condemned what they had allowed their temple to become. Notice in this passage that Jesus himself is no longer calling that building a temple. Instead, he does the unthinkable by referring to himself as the true temple. Now, of course, the temple authorities didn't pick up on that. They were thinking in literal terms. Therefore, the claim that Jesus was making about himself as being the true temple, as well as the prediction that he would be resurrected after being dead for 3 days, went right over their heads. But John, the gospel writer, wants us as his readers to know what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about his own body. And it's interesting that this is actually the second reference to Jesus as the temple in John's gospel. Do you remember where the first reference is? It's in the prologue. Chapter 1, verse 14 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt." That word is literally tabernacled among us. John told us right at the beginning that Jesus had come to be the true tabernacle or temple of God. And that was always God's plan. And what that means is that the physical edifice of the tabernacle or temple was always a type or a pointer to something greater to come. And God had indeed instituted the temple and everything associated with it, including the sacrifices. But a man-made temple was never meant to be the ultimate expression of God's presence with his people. The ultimate expression was always meant to be God himself in the form of a human being when the fullness of time had come. For God, that's always been the goal of history. From the very beginning, God has sought to dwell with his people. But because of human sin, a great chasm exists between God and sinful man. The tabernacle and the temple and their sacrifices were just temporary fixes to that problem of separation. They never fully or adequately bridged that gap. Which is why God the Father had to eventually send his Son to take on human nature, to live the life of a human, so that human beings could be truly reconciled to God. And Jesus gives us unhindered access to God. And that changes everything. And because Jesus is the true temple of God, it has changed the way the people of God worship. At the time of the Old Covenant, God had wanted his people to worship him by means of the temple. But with the advent of Jesus as God incarnate, God now wants his people to worship him by looking to Jesus, by orienting everything around him, not some man-made building or institution. Well, that doesn't mean that we forsake the institution of the church, but neither does it mean that we submit ourselves unreservedly to the church and to its leaders. Instead, we should submit ourselves unreservedly to Jesus. The triune God is the only thing in existence worthy of our worship and devotion. The religious leaders of Jesus' day had basically turned their religion into an idol. They were so concerned with maintaining it and protecting their position within it that they had forsaken the true worship of God. And that means that there's a double meaning there in Jesus' response to the Jewish leaders, which is something that John, the gospel writer, is kind of fond of. Note that Jesus says to them, "Destroy this temple." Now, he's not saying that he is going to destroy the temple, which is actually one of the false charges that they would eventually bring against him during his trial before his execution. No, he says, you all, or if you're from Texas, y'all, destroy the temple. And I say it's a double meaning because, number one, the Jewish leaders had already basically destroyed the substance of the temple, so that by that time it was a shell of its former self. And number two, they would destroy the temple, the true temple, which was Jesus' body, when they sent him to be crucified. The difference is that the old temple would not rise again, whereas the true temple of Jesus' body would rise again. And that means that if they or anyone else wanted a saving relationship with God, they would have to stop putting their trust and absolute devotion into a human institution and start placing it into the living temple, who is Jesus Christ. Well, since about 2,000 years ago, that's the new reality that God has placed his people under. We no longer seek connection with him through animal sacrifices or the observation of various feast days. Now we simply have to embrace Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of everything the temple and the law and the sacrifices were pointing to. Well, there's a lot of people out there today, especially on the internet, who want your attention and your devotion. And they'll try to peddle various philosophies that are either rehashed heresies from the past or else things that they make up themselves that are just misguided. Alternatively, there are those who even say that we should go back to the religious practices of the ancient Jews, complete with the kosher laws and sacrifices. But in light of all that, we should remember Paul's words in Colossians chapter 2, where he writes this: "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world, rather than on Christ. For in Christ all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form, and in Christ you have been brought to fullness. He is the head over every power and authority." Our trust and devotion should be to Christ alone. He is the only one who has any true authority over us. He is the only one who is truly trustworthy. He is the true temple. He is Emmanuel. So let us trust and obey him.